Every year, millions of people leave their country to move to Europe in the hope of a new, better life. However, in this journey, they often come against challenges such as racism and social exclusion. This AMIF project opens up a new path for the inclusion of migrants, who, if they are embraced as valuable members of our communities, they can contribute to the welfare of the European Union as a whole.
A very warm welcome to today's guests, speakers, and participants of our session at the Rethinking Integration on a European Level series. I repeated, obviously still after 2 years, but we're on Zoom. So please, if you're not speaking, unmute your microphone. This is meant to be an interactive session. So whenever you feel like sharing, commenting, asking questions, you can use the raise your hand button, or you can directly send questions into the chat, or you can use the question and answer session. I hope that works with everyone. Today, we focus on a very interesting topic, I think, which is the topic of social cohesion. When we talk about integration and inclusion of migrants, it is very important to not forget about the aspects, the good and the bad aspects of social cohesion, because in the end, what does it mean? We need social cohesion in a way that we need to live together as a society, but maybe heterogeneity can even strengthen social cohesion. And I think especially in the context of migrant inclusion and integration, there always is the danger of assimilation, of white saviorism, and of adapting to a norm. So what we try today is to come closer to this topic. And we do that with two very wonderful inputs. As always, we start with ourselves, with the partners from the Embracing Project. Today, we have Socrates from the pilot in Ngomi, who will share about the very practical experience. And after that, we'll have an input from Angelo Camufingo. He's a public speaker on education and anti-racism, and he currently focuses his research on anti-racist education, colonial continuities, and many other things, which I will share when he's about to talk. So welcome, Angelo and Socrates. And Socrates, I'll ask you to start to share with us the experiences you make when we talk about local cohesion in the framework of the Embracing Project.
Thank you, Evie, and good morning to everyone. Let me share my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, we see it perfectly fine.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Socrates Aris, and I am the project manager of Embracing Project in Ngomi, Cyprus. As you can see, Municipality of Ngomi is a member of the Embracing Project, and Ngomi is located in the center of Cyprus at Eastern Mediterranean. A geographical crossroad in a complex region itself, Cyprus is divided since Turkey invasion in 1974. Cyprus has witnessed a tremendous increase in the number of people seeking asylum during the last years. According to Eurostat reports, Cyprus continues to receive the most first-time applicants for asylum per capita in Europe, and actually it's 12 times the EU average. Though Syrians continue to make up the larger number of new applications, there has been a steady increase in the number of migrants arriving from Africa. NCOMI participated as a pilot city to the Embracing project, and our beneficiaries are all newcomers from Africa. Namely, we have from Nigeria, Somalia, and Cameroon. So let's say something about NCOMI. NCOMI is a suburb of the capital city, Nicosia, known with its medieval name, Nicosia. NCOMI was created during 16th century during the building of the new Venetian walls of Nicosia. And its name originates from the Greek words nea, new, and komi, town, so meaning new town. NCOMI's initial center was an area near the old Greek Orthodox churches of St. Nicholas and St. Procopius. NCOMI became municipality in 1986. The original small village expanded rapidly, and now it's a major business, commercial, sports, and educational center of Cyprus, and also one of the most developing residential area of Nicosia district. Two of four private universities are located in NCOMI, namely the University of Nicosia and European University of Cyprus. For that reason, NCOMI hosts many foreign students, including European students and students from third countries. NCOMI has also a large diplomatic presence with many embassies such as USA, Russia, Ukraine, Italy, India, located in the area. Municipality of NCOMI has been participating for the last years in projects for the integration of third country nationals, among other the European project programs for integration of third country nationals by local authorities, YAPE, Youth Empowerment and Innovation Project, MIICT, and of course, Embrace. So let's move to our today's topic. What are the specific goals regarding the topic of local cohesion? Our first goal is to provide to our beneficiaries with guidance and empowerment. Secondly, to give them the opportunities for socialization, interaction with Cypriots. And last not least, we realize that language barriers must be overcome in order to get the ability to communicate more easily and more effectively with the locals. It is useful to remind that one of the main pillars of the Embracing project is the holistic approach, and that we work with a multidisciplinary team. Therefore, in order to achieve these goals, we work close in this area with social workers, psychologists, volunteers, and the Greek language teachers. So what is being done in order to achieve these goals? We provide them with information and guidance about culture of Cyprus and the locals' attitude in cultural orientation seminars. These seminars are organized in collaboration with volunteers from University of Nicosia. And we try to achieve this goal also in more informal ways, such as through trips. Let's say, for example, Lefkara Traditional Village and Troodos Mountains. We provide also them with empowerment to be able to act independently and face cases of xenophobia and discrimination. The role of the psychologist and the social worker is very important. So we arrange weekly meetings, both individual and in group, with the beneficiaries. Moreover, we organize psychoeducational seminars, for example, about the effective communication and stereotypes and discrimination. During the pilot phase, we give opportunities for socialization, interaction with the locals through trips, events, sports, and volunteering. It is indeed very important to see migrants working with locals in joint groups for a common goal, and we consider this to be the highlight of the integration. Of course, contributes a lot to the local cohesion. We provide also twice a week Greek language lessons. Beneficiaries consider that the lessons as a very important aspect in order to be able to communicate effectively and sufficiently with the locals, because they have not yet acquired a good level of speaking in Greek. We sometimes had to mediate in order to facilitate the communication with the locals and to prevent misunderstandings. So, challenges. Which challenges have come up in trying to reach these goals? A major problem was bureaucracy and COVID pandemic. There was a challenge to find the people in charge at the Ministry of Education and to be able to enroll our beneficiaries in Greek lessons. It turned out to be extremely difficult to approve the creation of another new Greek language class, especially for our beneficiaries, since fewer people enter the classroom due to pandemic measures. An important obstacle for social cohesion is the stereotypes and the discrimination against migrants, but also against locals. When migrants are treated unfairly by locals simply because of who they are, and when they realize that they are marginalized or receive inferior services because of their color or their origin, negative emotions are created for the locals. Migrants continue to feel as foreigners, and it's difficult to convince them to feel Cyprus as their new country and be fully integrated in the society. On the other hand, it is always easy to persuade, it's not easy to persuade locals to trust migrants, and for example, to rent them an apartment or to offer them a job. Actually, we had some cases in which locals refused to do so for our beneficiaries. According to Eurostat surveys, Cypriots listed the migration as one of the four most important problems of the country. As Cyprus continues to receive migration flows too large for island size, many locals consider migration as a threat for Cyprus' security and identity. The government was unprepared and is unable to deal with the problem, and in many cases offers insufficient services and also poor living conditions in the first reception centers. As a result, there is an increase of intentions near and inside the centers, both among migrants and locals, as well as among migrants. Unfortunately, these phenomena reproduce and reinforce stereotypes in the community against actually both sides, and do not help the procedure of integration of migrants in order to achieve social cohesion. Okay. So that was my presentation, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Socrates. So are there any questions from the audience? Okay. I don't see any questions, so I like would have a question that probably also connects already very well to the next input. So Socrates, you shared that in the end, like you said, sides, like both sides, like the newcomers, but also the local communities, like have stereotypes, so to say, about each other. And what is the experience when it comes to the aspects of power when we talk about these stereotypes? You know, like, is it really like a equal thing, like one stereotype and the other? Or do you also perceive like a certain aspect of power of the local community that in the end makes migrants or like forces migrants to adapt?
Okay, yeah. Of course, the migrants are in less good conditions and an inferior situation. And so locals have the power, locals give the jobs, locals offer the rent the apartments. So it's a it's an issue of discrimination. So we have discrimination. Maybe we don't have racism in Cyprus. Maybe it's not an issue of racism, but we have discriminations clearly, and it's not easy to change the whole society, the locals. And maybe it's easier, of course, it's easier to work with a small group of migrants and explain them, try to understand the locals and their attitudes and their fears, and help them and empower them to face these attitudes and these discriminations.
Thank you so much, Socrates. Are there any other questions? Okay.
Maybe I've got one.
Yes, Nils.
Like last week, we heard from Nicosia, who's an activist in Greece, who founded an NGO, I think it was called Generation for Change, who was also talking about this. And I was just wondering, are there like two sides on the island where people are perceiving these projects and any efforts to improve the conditions as something bad? Is there like two sides, or is it civil society as a whole is mostly critical of migrants? Like, I'm wondering about the political dimension in the society there.
Of course, not all Cypriots have these feelings about migration. And of course, not all migrants have bad feelings about Cypriots. But let's say maybe the majority of them feels migration as consider migration as a threat. Yeah, and yeah, there's a problem to convince them, to persuade them that this migrant is not a problem for you, will not be a thief or not dirty, or will not destroy Cyprus identity, and these all issues. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think this all already connects very well to the input of our next speaker, who also will like focus on the aspects of discrimination and racism within the dynamic between host communities and migrated people. Welcome, Angelo. As I shared already in the beginning, Angelo is a public speaker on issues around anti-racism and education, at the moment focusing his research on colonial continuities and anti-racist education in schools. He works for several NGOs producing wonderful materials. He was like speaker at the EU Anti-Racism Summit this year. Maybe some of you saw him also there. He's a member of the Diversity Auditing Steering Committee at the University of Potsdam. So I think, Angelo, you bring a lot of expertise to bring in this power critical lens when we talk about aspects of social cohesion and the dynamics happening. So a very warm welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Evie. Oh Lord, I haven't spoken today. Thank you, Evie, for this invitation, and thank you, Niels, also. Yeah, I'm going to try to give a few impulses. Obviously, there's never enough time to speak about these topics in like full depth, but I hope that I can shed some light on some important aspects. So I'm going to share my presentation right away. And I'm going to obviously talk about white saviorism and structural racism in this context, like Evie has already mentioned. And I just want to shed a little bit of light on to these topics with respect to integration and to social cohesion. White saviorism as a very important aspect, and I'm going to start with this picture simply because I feel that's a good explanation for what we understand when we speak about white savior complex or white saviorism, which mostly is referred to when we speak about voluntary work and voluntarism with respect to, for example, people who've just finished school traveling to different so-called third world countries and trying to do help, but there's obviously a disconnect as to what help actually means in these contexts. And this picture is a perfect implication of who is being shown to do this work and what does it actually mean. And there's different things that can be said about the white savior complex or white saviorism, and we have here a list of things that are relevant. It has to be understood as something that is often subconscious and is not necessarily about intention, but rather something that is a continuity, specifically a colonial one. And it refers to those who work from the assumption that they know best or better what BIPOCs or racialized people need. It's also swooping into make a difference without stopping to consider whether that difference might not in fact have more negative effects than positive ones. And it's often only resulting in performative activism or social media exploitation, as we just have seen, or CV related benefits. So people basically doing help for their own benefit rather than for the benefits of the people that they're actually helping. Then we have actions usually involve very little input from the people that they're attempting to help. The intentions might be noble, as I said before, but still emphasize inequality because they continue to center the actions of white people while ignoring or even invalidating the experiences of those that they're claiming to help. And it echoes imperialist and colonialist beliefs by putting white people in the role of guiding responsibility figures. And last but not least, it continues to reinforce the false beliefs implying that people of color or Black people, racialized people need strong and capable white leaders and educators to create specific change. This is a very broad description of white saviorism, but to maybe narrow it down when we speak about integration work specifically, there are certain questions in the realm of white saviorism that we have to ask ourselves. One of them being who knows best, which is one of the things that was already on the list. That's kind of the question, okay, we think about people that are involved in integration work, who are the people that tend to know best, that tend to think that whatever they assume to be important is actually important, right? Is it the host country, for example? Is it the people that are arriving in the specific country? That's one of the questions that has to be thought through here. Another one is who makes decisions, specifically when it comes to what actions are being funded, what focus is being set, and so on and so forth. There's always a question on who's making the decision. Is it people that are doing this integration work, or is it the people that are actually supposed to benefit from this work? And another question is who can take part in this integration work? So it's always a question of participation, and there's always a question as to how much are we involving affected people into the things that we are trying to do differently, or into the things that we are trying to create benefits from. And then we have to speak about whose work is recognized and supported. This one is specifically with respect to local organizers, to community organizers, also questioning, who do we see when we think of specific work in the integration? For example, if I think about Germany, a lot of work has been done by affected communities, has been done by groups such as International Women's Space, Women in Exile, Refugee Emancipation, or Each One Teach One, for example, all people that are either have a history of migration or flight, or are affected by racism. And oftentimes these perspectives and this support is kind of like not recognized in the same way that big, mostly white organizations are being recognized, for example. And then obviously the other question is who benefits from the work, which is also something that was mentioned before with respect to, first of all, is everyone who we are trying to appeal to benefiting or able to benefit from the work that we do, but then also is the benefit bigger for the people that help or bigger for the people that are supposed to, like I said, benefit from this help. To go into a little bit more detail here, there are, like I said before, some issues of integration that then come to mind and that we kind of have to take into consideration when dealing with these specific issues and topics. One of them, integration, sometimes leading to the, or like being the idea of assimilation. So I think that was mentioned before already. Also where it's kind of a question of what does integration mean to us? Does it actually mean inclusion or does it actually mean assimilation? Do we want people to simply change their ways so they somehow fit, if you want to say so, into the society that they are now in? Or do we actually want to create structures and systems for people to function as full human beings and the human beings that they are and as the human beings that they came as? Because one thing that we have also as a German example, another one is that the idea of integration still very much is, okay, here are the rules of how you have to behave in a specific context, in a specific country. Those are the things that you can and can't do. This is something that you should avoid. Those are the rules and the things that are like, that are just set in a specific context. Whereas the original idea or like the actual idea of integration should rather be how can we, like I said, create an environment that is more so inclusive and inviting of these different perspectives and create something where people are able to participate and living out their full like living realities. Another aspect is structural discrimination. And I think that's important because integration doesn't eradicate structural discrimination, which means people are always gonna enter environments in where there's like discrimination a part of it. So I'm not specifically talking about the discrimination that people experience as migrants, as refugees. I'm talking about discrimination that is set in any social context anyway, which means not only are they faced by the discrimination that they face based on the role that they have taken on because of migration or flight, but they're also coming into systems that already have specific forms of discrimination that are basically adding to the experiences that they already have. So it's important to remember that not only do we have to support or to work through the discrimination that they face in their current position, but we have to recognize we have to also be able to educate, but also to take into consideration what are the social dynamics in this space that people are coming into that are also going to affect them eventually. This kind of plays into the next thing that I put on the list, which is intersectionality. Yes, there are issues of xenomisia and racism, but also these are related to other living realities as we all are complex human beings and we're not just affected by one form of discrimination or by one thing that affects our lives, which means women, for example, have different challenges as maybe people who face racism and are in wheelchairs or are depressed. And a big aspect is neurodiversity, which has to be taken into consideration. Another aspect can be sexual orientation, can be religion. All of these things are intertwined and have to be thought together in this context. As the next point, I put xenomisia and racism. Xenomisia, also understood as xenophobia. Misia is the ending that actually speaks about the hatred and not about the fear. Xenomisia and racism, I put here the sign that says it's not the same. I think that's important to recognize with respect to, for example, if we look to the whole situation between refugees that come from, for example, African countries or versus refugees that come from Ukraine. Currently, there is like differences in dynamics as to what people experience. And at the same time, we have to recognize if we look at migration data, for example, that is often being used for integration work, not every migrant is facing racism, for example. Not every person who faces racism is actually like listed as a migrant, for example, depending on that specific definition of the term in the specific space. So we have to make a clear distinction here as to what these terms mean and how these experiences maybe also add up to one another depending on the different positions. Another important aspect is migrants versus refugees. If you talk to many specifically community-led refugee organizations, they want to make very clear distinction between migration and flight, simply because of the aspect of choice, which is very relevant here. And they also want to put a focus on the fact that they are not simply migrants because they didn't necessarily choose to come to certain places, but they didn't really have an option, which also creates a completely different environment if you think about the decisions that are being made, the opportunities that are coming with this. Because often migrants, specifically nowadays, depending on the reason of migration, often migrants have a specific time to prepare, for example, to go to a different space rather than having to flee, for example, from where they're actually from. Another aspect is I put here no assets. What that means is recognizing that migrants and refugees are not assets to a society, which means oftentimes in integration projects, one of the ideas is that we have to ensure proper integration and inclusion so they become, so migrants and refugees can become an integral part of society and can benefit to the society that they're now in. And this idea of a benefit can be quite problematic because the purpose for integration shouldn't only be that they eventually become an asset or a resource to bring a society further, but they should also it should also just simply be a human right to be accepted and integrated into the space and society that you're in, regardless of the fact if you're benefiting monetarily or whatever to this society or not. Another aspect is reliability versus priority. I'm not sure why I put versus. That was just a slash, supposed to be a slash. But one of the points here is also when we look into the work of integration and also specifically the work with refugees, it's kind of how long and in which circumstances are these issues and these topics a priority. If we look into the pandemic, for example, refugees and migrants were not the first priority when it came to actually making sure to protect people, to continuously integrate people, and to build structures that are actually furthering social cohesion in this context, for example. And last but not least, I put agency. So not to forget that migrants and refugees have agency, which means they're not just people that we have to make decisions on or that we have to move around or whatsoever, but they actually have agency, they have an education, they have a mind of their own, and it's important to recognize them as full human beings and not as something that is just part of our decision making. So to kind of summarize this, I put, again, integration cannot take place at eye level because power dynamics and privileges do not simply disappear. However, integration must be critical, inclusive, equitable, and participatory, including working with communities and supporting community-led organizers. I think one of the most important parts, and that's also what I always talk about when I work with specifically refugee-related organizations in Germany, is that it's important to recognize that this process does not take place at eye level ever, which doesn't mean that that's not the goal. It just simply means that it's impossible to avoid the power dynamics, and it's much more important to kind of reflect on them and think them through and kind of think about alternative ways in which we can make long-lasting and effective changes rather than trying to act as if there is no difference. Because, and that was also mentioned before already, there is obviously power in terms of who makes a decision, who is giving jobs, who is giving education, but then also in terms of languages, in terms of being socialized in a specific space and understanding social norms, religions, and so on and so forth. So it's impossible to just eradicate these power dynamics. What we need for effective social cohesion in this context, or for effective integration, then is obviously self-reflection. I said this before. We do have to think about anti-racism, and I put anti-racism again because a lot of people don't understand that it's not about not being racist. We have to actively do something that goes against racism, that is preventive of racism in these situations, but that also goes into society, building a bigger understanding of racist dynamics in the country also historically. Then we have, I put DEIS development, which stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice development. I put this here Also because not only is integration something that is relevant for the people that we try to integrate, it's also relevant for the people that are part of the host society or that are part of the country in which that's supposed to happen. So understanding that integration isn't a process that goes one way, where it's about, okay, we have to integrate these people. No, we also have to effectively change something about the ways that people are inviting people or are welcoming people and so on and so forth. So understanding that the changes that we, or the assimilations or the integrations, inclusivity that we want to achieve with in the specific context of work is not only directed towards people that are migrating or fleeing, it's also has to be directed to the people, to the general society, and to the people that do this specific work. Then I put history education, understanding colonial continuities, understanding colonial history, histories of xenomysia and racism in specific contexts is relevant for us to understand why certain things might work or not work if we take certain measures, if we try to build certain programs, if we try to do certain forms of inclusion. We have to understand what are the dynamics that stand behind these things. Also with respect to how do we speak to people, how shouldn't we speak to people, how do people speak to each other, and why there's a lot that we have to also constantly dismantle. And then I put D in anti-colonial practices, which goes into what I just said, basically. And last but not least, I put dismantling systems of oppression, again, focusing on this inclusive, intersectional aspect of discrimination also, trying to constantly have to kind of dismantle and reflect on the specific power structures that are taking place in the context of this work. Okay, I tried to rush through and I hope I could set some impulses, and I'm going to stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Angelo. I think it was like many impulses in such a short time. So let's see maybe if there are already some questions from the audience and the partners. Yes, there is one question from Niels.
That's less of a question, but just the thought that I keep on going the same loops. Like the self-reflection part, I think, is crucial. And I think some sessions before, I made the argument actually to say, like, in order to convince people, you can make the argument saying it's also for the benefit if your need for working people, it makes sense. Which was the take of the person giving the input. And I know that, like, when I'm reflecting it, I know this is not fine, but I keep on doing this loop, which I find noteworthy. Or I just wanted to share this, that even though I have reflected on this, it keeps on coming back to me. So I think this is very hard work to consider this, which I thought throughout the presentation actually.
Thank you, Niels. There is one other comment in the chat from Paula. You haven't mentioned awareness raising in order to create focus on the inclusion aspect in local societies regarding the newcomers. Paola, could you clarify maybe a bit what do you mean by that?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
So listen, I thought maybe there should be some actions proposed, maybe on, I don't know, I didn't quite get that part from your talk about how to be able to help the society include the newcomers. Because it won't happen by itself, I don't think so. That's the problem.
I think that's a very valid point. I don't necessarily think that was my task right now. It was more so to give impulses on the problematic things overall.
No,
I think
no, of course not. No, I just mentioned that it's an aspect though that needs to be looked at too.
Yeah, I think that is something that is definitely the next step, specifically after this like self-reflection and the dismantling of these situations and like realizing, okay, what are the societal situations and the dynamics, it's important to kind of think about, okay, what can we do in order to like raise this general awareness? That's for sure. I think education is a big part of that though. There's also something that is like a continuous task on specific levels of education, starting in elementary school, ending in university, or like not ending, but going to university and so forth.
Yeah, something like this. This is what I'm looking for. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Paula. Are there any other questions or comments? I give you some time to think before I ask like some questions I have. Okay. So, Angelo, I would love to hear from you when we talk about the European context in a way, because this is a European project, of course, and all the pilots in the end, like they follow a very similar structure, while the local context and circumstances are, of course, very different. And I think also when we talk about anti-racism, like, or decolonial work, also like the local context in a way all across Europe, they differ from one another. So I'm curious to hear what you think about these European-wide approaches, because in the end, what this project tries is to develop a way of hosting migrants that works all across Europe, following a very like similar structure. And I think that, yeah, I would be curious to hear what you think, like talking about like these power critical aspects. Is it like a good thing to try, or is it dangerous? Yeah.
I think it is something important to try, but I do think what you just said is kind of relevant for it, right? Where it's like there's very different contexts and realities in different countries with respect to different issues and forms of discrimination, for example. And I think the issue is that often isn't really thought through. When I think about ECA, actually, I gave a workshop for a French-German organization, and that was about like city partnership and town partnerships. We also spoke about how ECA is like having this anti-racism action plan for city partnerships and stuff like that. And we talked about this specifically. And what was very relevant for the workshop most of the time was really constantly a comparison between dynamics in France and dynamics in Germany with respect to racism. And it took us eventually so much time to like go through these, but afterwards it was much easier for them to think of ideas that maybe function on both ways, or where the focus maybe is different depending on which country we're focusing on, or where maybe with relation to cities in this context, like there's different tasks that they have to take on depending on where they are. So I think like the focus has to be much bigger on the dynamics in the countries, and countries have to kind of like be much more open about like talking about social dynamics with respect to specifically racism, because also that is something that functions very differently in very different spaces, which is a very big task, I think. But if you really want to me, it's always like if you have if you have a goal that's supposed to like create effective change specifically on a European level, that means you have to do a lot more background work with respect to what that actually means and how it can function for different people in different spaces.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? So I have another question. So what we also see, like we had like one meeting in Sevilla just in April with all the partners, and we talked a bit about the topic of racism, white saviorism within the project. That's why we'll also make this like a highlight topic in the Living Lab in Heidelberg. But what we see is that it's very difficult to bring this in like when the project is already ongoing, in a way that of course there is certain things that the application and the draft says. Yeah, so also there would be curious what you think could be like concrete ideas that are possible if the framework is already set, because the framework is nothing that the pilots can change at the moment. So the certain structure is already given. So what do you think can be done, even though there's a very fixed structure, which is in this case the 6+6x6 approach, which means that cities or hosts or families are taking in one like newcomer and have support from 6 experts in the, let's say, integration process. So that's basically what all the pilots are doing at the moment. So it's a very fixed framework. Yeah, so do you have any ideas on how to deal with the fact that the framework is fixed and that there's also some frustration coming up due to the fact that it's fixed?
Yeah, I think that's always difficult if you already have like such a fixed frame, and then you're supposed to like make changes that are kind of integral to the whole idea of the project or the pilot. I think depending, I mean, I don't necessarily work in this like with these people, so it's hard for me to talk about their frustrations and how they could be tackled, right? But with respect to making changes, I think maybe sometimes it's not specifically about making a change, but like adding something to it. So I think sometimes making additions that are relevant for the things that are already put in place can help, which means like, I don't know, adding an additional step or adding, like making specific things that are relevant to make a change, make them seem as a reward, for example. So if you do this and this in the form of the framework, there is a training that is a reward, a free training as a reward for something or something. I think like developing structures that are kind of like adding and that are being put on top of these like fixed things can help, or simply also using the framework that is fixed that might be problematic in certain instances as an exercise. Like if for example, if you present a fixed framework to people, you can automatically ask people, what do you think might be problematic like with this in this particular part, and how do you think we should approach that or tackle that? So kind of like when I think about, for example, me, when I work with teachers and we work with books that they don't really have a choice over, and this book, for example, like recreates racist narratives or whatever, like usually I still tell them you can still use this book and you can still use the tasks that are in there, and you can like kind of change the narrative about these tasks and these points in the book and just ask students like, what do you see is problematic in there, and like make use of things that might not be perfectly put or might not be very like critical or thought through, and just kind of like take people to action, I guess, and kind of, yeah, again, like also add stuff to it. I'm not sure if that specifically responds.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes, from Sandra, could you maybe elaborate a little on how the social structure, mainly referring to economic and cultural hegemonies, play a role vis-a-vis the dynamics you have presented? Is the question clear to you, or should I ask Sandra to explain it a bit more?
I would love for Sandra to explain it a bit more, yeah.
Yes, Sandra, could you maybe explain the question a little bit more in detail? Okay, you lost your voice. Okay, so we try it. So
could you maybe elaborate a little on how the social structure plays a role vis-a-vis the dynamics you have presented? Economics and cultural.
Maybe Sandra, you can clarify like what you mean with the dynamics you have presented, because I think like for me, Angelo presented many dynamics in a way just to know what you actually mean by that. The role of social classes.
Okay, I'm gonna try and answer. I'm not sure if I'm gonna actually respond to your specific questions, but I can definitely try. So elaborating on like the social structure when it comes to the specific dynamics in the integration, inclusion, assimilation. What I meant, and I think that's what you're referring to, is just that it's impossible to ignore that there is specific dynamics when it comes to certain processes. So for example, if we think about like one social dynamic in Germany, for example, is that Germany is one of the European countries that is, even though many people might not think that, is like one of the countries where the relation between social heritage and class, and educational benefits and education in general is extremely interconnected, which means it's almost impossible for specific people from specific classes to actually jump that class based on education or get a better education, which is because, for example, in certain districts, because there's people who make less income and so on and so forth, schools in these districts also get less resources, which then results in the way that people are being educated. And then these people have or don't have chances to further their education, basically. And if you think that through with respect to integration and migration, for example, or flight, often people out of these contexts, if they're able to move or get their own places, they will get places in these districts because those are, for example, districts that are more affordable, that then results again in their children going to these schools, and their children might not having the same opportunities when it comes to education as, for example, children that are, I don't know, part of families that are from the host country and have much more opportunities, for example. So that's, for example, one of the dynamics. And there's like, you will find specific dynamics that are specifically relevant in that aspect, because oftentimes I think we think, oh, we give people the resources to be integrated and to find certain things, but then kind of thinking through what that means in a step system when they are actually trying to make a life in these specific spaces is a completely different story. Or, for example, degrees, whether they are being accepted or not accepted, and if there are programs in specific places in the country or in different countries that are actually bringing people on the way to have their degrees being acknowledged. For example, there was a program at the University of Potsdam that was kind of trying to create a program that was acknowledging teachers' education from people out of different countries. But for example, that is a very singular program that's not working in every state, for example. So kind of also we have another correlation where it's like, if people who have fled, for example, can't choose the places where they live, but then that also correlates with whether their jobs are being acknowledged or not, that obviously again plays a role with respect to social heritage and class. And there's like multiple dynamics, I think, that we could go into detail. I hope that was kind of what you were referring to.
Thank you, Angelo. Niels, you want to add on that?
Somewhat. I was just thinking that we had often the aspect of policies not being universally fitting for the whole of Europe due to different conditions. But I was just thinking about the education aspect, because this would be one policy fitting anywhere, about anti-racist education, etc., right? Because the first one that I can think of that is A, important, and B, actually viable to implement all over Europe. Would you agree to that?
In an ideal world, yes. I think it starts with countries having very different ideas of what they understand as racism and what they don't understand as racism. That's probably where you have the first issue. And then also, just because education oftentimes isn't necessarily something that is only thought of like nationwide, but also like state related, like federal state related. If you look again, Germany, for example, like, yes, there are certain educational rules that are German wide, but usually it's like a decision that is up to the specific states. And that's where you have one of the issues. Another issue is that countries are already at different points in time where, like, depending on how they deal with the issues. For example, I talked to a Swedish teacher yesterday who said that it's now becoming a Swedish law to actually talk about different forms of discrimination and like really make that has to be part of the curriculum. And that is again related to other issues as well, because, for example, Sweden mostly works with digital resources when it comes to books and materials. So for them, it's quite easy to just adapt all their materials to these topics, whereas in other countries, that's not the case. And there's other hurdles when it comes to kind of implementing these things. So it could be something that could be done EU-wide, but then there would have to be that would have to be a very, very intense sit down on as to how to make that possible for every country, depending on the different resources and the different points where you have to pick them up, basically.
There's a comment from Sandra in the chat. Thank you, Angelo. Yes, I have seen educational segregation that is related not only to ethnic or national background, but the position on the social economic ladder, place of living, metropolitan areas, and small or medium cities.
I think that's exactly the important part. I think we sometimes underestimate how strongly social economic background and social economic ladder is related to ethnic or national backgrounds. If unfortunately in Europe, we don't necessarily have data on communities that are faced by racism, because the data on migrational background isn't necessarily clear, because like I said, not every person who has a migrational background faces racism. But if there are certain studies that correlate migration, but also racism experiences to social economic backgrounds, which kind of ties into the things that I said before. And again, from a German context, for example, if you think about who are the kids that are getting suggestions for certain schools, types of schools that eventually lead to higher education and so on and so forth, like there's a specific way in which ethnic, national backgrounds, all of these things, racism kind of continuously reproduce like social economic positionings and social economics in general. So, but yeah, like educational segregation is real, and I think not addressed enough in Europe generally. So
thank you all so much for elaborating on the interesting discussion. So see if there are any other questions, comments. Okay, not at the moment. So thank you very much, Angelo. All the partners will meet Angelo again, as he will be one of the speakers also at our Living Lab in Heidelberg. So there'll be the chance to work further on these topics. Thank you also again, Socrates, for joining and being there. Now you disappeared. Probably you can still hear us. Socrates, are you still there?
Yes, Valerie. Thank
Yes.
you very much.
Okay, and thank you all. We continue at 11:30, and there we will focus on the layer of interaction with host communities and how to work on active participation. I think this is something that Angelo also mentioned, how important it is to work together with community organizing and BIPOC-led organizations. So in the next session, we'll have the chance to dive more into that. So thank you all for joining, and I hope to see you all again at 11:30. Bye.